Sable Creek sat at the edge of nowhere, clinging to the sunburnt skin of the American frontier like a scab waiting to peel. Dust rose in slow whirls with every passing step, and the wind had the voice of old bones whispering across the mesas. The town itself was little more than a handful of wooden buildings weathered gray by the desert sun: saloon, general store, livery, church, schoolhouse, and the blacksmith's forge, where the only real fire burned. No trains came here. Only grit, silence, and the kind of folk who'd run out of road. At the end of the main street, the forge belched smoke into the sky like a chimney from hell itself. The clang of metal echoed with steady rhythm, measured, slow, and relentless. That sound belonged to Eli Mercer. Folks called him Cole, partly because of the way he always seemed covered in soot, and partly because if you ever looked close enough into his eyes, you'd swear something smoldered deep inside. Eli was a man carved from the land, tall, wide-shouldered, but aged in a way that no longer made him intimidating, just immovable. A permanent limp bent his walk, a crookedness that told of old pain but never explained it. His face was darkened by the forge and wrinkled by time. It wore silence like armor. He spoke when spoken to, usually with a nod. No one knew where he came from, only that he'd been in Sable Creek for near 20 years, hammering iron and minding his own. Every morning, Clara Winslow brought him coffee. She wore long dresses in pale earth tones, hair pinned high beneath a wide straw hat, and eyes that somehow stayed soft despite all they'd seen. A widow for nearly 5 years, Clara ran the one-room schoolhouse on the east side of town and read psalms with her students every morning before teaching them their letters. She never said much about her late husband. She had the kind of smile that made children straighten their backs and cowards rethink their tone. Clara and Eli never touched, never lingered, but every morning she came with a warm cup and a quiet nod. He'd offer a grunt of thanks, maybe a small smile, and then go back to work. Once, when the bell at the schoolhouse cracked and the town council debated paying to fix it, Eli had simply shown up that evening with new fittings and mended it by lantern light. The next morning, Clara brought him 2 coffees, and the second cup stayed untouched beside him long after she'd gone. It was a Tuesday when the Bone Dust Gang rode in, kicking up gravel and stirring the wind into angry tantrums. 5 brothers, all tall, lean, and dirty in the way that couldn't be washed off. They moved like coyotes through chicken coops, lazy but watchful. At their center was Riker Bone, the oldest, loudest, and most dangerous. His hat sat crooked over wild blonde hair, and he wore a long duster that flapped like wings behind him. Gold tooth flashing, pistol tied low, and voice sharp with mockery, Riker didn't ride into towns, he invaded them. The townsfolk watched from behind windows and doorways, mothers pulling children close. Sheriff Nate tipped his hat nervously and retreated into his office with his deputy. The saloon doors flung wide as the gang rode up, and Riker dismounted in a practiced swing, boots thudding into dust. Clara had just stepped out of the general store, basket on her arm, when Riker spotted her. He whistled low. "Well now," he said, sauntering forward. "What's a pretty thing like you doing in a dusty grave like this?" Clara didn't flinch. "I teach children how not to become men like you." That got chuckles from the others, but not Riker. He tilted his head and took a step closer. "You got some fire, I like that." He leaned forward, close enough that Clara had to stiffen her spine to stay upright. "Tell you what, I'm fixin' to stay a while. Maybe I'll learn a few things from you, like how a lonely schoolmarm keeps herself warm at night." The insult cracked across the street like a whip. Conversation stopped. Horses stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause. Clara's face turned red, not from shame, but rage, and she opened her mouth to speak again when a clang interrupted. From the forge came the sound of metal striking metal. Steady, deliberate, like a drumbeat announcing judgment. Eli Mercer stood at his anvil, hammer in hand, eyes locked on the hot blade he was shaping. He hadn't turned when Riker spoke, hadn't said a word, but now he lifted his gaze, just for a moment. It was enough. The look wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was something far colder. Riker followed the glance and scoffed. "You him," Riker called out, walking a few steps toward the forge. "You the one she's sweet on?" The one what lets his woman get talked down to in the street. Eli said nothing. His hammer rose and fell again. Riker turned to the crowd. Ain't that something? Blacksmith can't even walk straight, let alone stand tall. He barked a laugh. He ain't even got the guts to protect his own woman. Clang. The hammer hit again. Eli's eyes dropped back to the iron. Sparks flew. Heat rose in waves. Riker chuckled and spun back toward the saloon, waving to his brothers like he'd won a card game. That's right, he said over his shoulder. You go on hammering, old man. Long as you don't get in my way, I won't break what's yours. Clara stood frozen for a moment, then walked briskly toward the schoolhouse, jaw set tight. The crowd began to move again, quiet murmurs filling the street. No one spoke to Eli. No one dared. Inside the forge, the fire hissed as coal fed the flames. Eli lifted the iron from the heat and struck again. Again. And again. The shape it was taking was no horseshoe. Out in the street, Riker Bone ordered whiskey and laughed like a man who thought himself safe. Back in the shadows of the forge, when no one could see his face, Eli Mercer's jaw clenched. The rhythm of the hammer slowed, not in weariness, but in control. The kind of control that only comes before something long buried wakes up again. And in that place of fire and steel, with sweat soaking his shirt and silence all around, the Limping Blacksmith forged more than iron. He forged his reckoning. The morning after Riker Bone spat his insult across the street, Sable Creek stirred with the uneasy energy of a place where something sacred had been stepped on, and no one had done a damn thing about it. They whispered in the saloon, around the church steps, and behind the counters of the general store. Some kept their voices low, while others made sure they were heard. He just stood there, they'd say. Didn't even flinch. Others were harsher. Guess all that hammering knocked the fight out of him. One old widow muttered, or maybe he never had it to begin with. Some defended him, but only barely. Man's had a hard life. Maybe he's just tired. You seen that leg. Can't expect a man like that to square off with 5 killers. But even those words were laced with disappointment. In a place where justice was scarce and mercy even scarcer, Eli Mercer's silence felt like betrayal. By midweek, the gossip reached every corner of the town. They all remembered his limp, the slow drag of his left foot, the way he favored his right when stepping down from the porch. Folks said it came from a mine collapse out near Bitter Ridge years back. A shaft caved in and buried 7 men. Eli made it out, but only just. He'd never confirmed or denied it, but the story stuck. That night, Clara came to the forge again, same as always. But there was no coffee in her hands. She stood at the threshold while he stoked the fire, the red glow flickering against his face. You didn't have to fight them, she said softly, her voice barely louder than the hiss of coal. But you should have looked at me. Eli's hammer froze in midair, then gently dropped onto the anvil. He turned toward her, but said nothing. His face was unreadable in the firelight, a sculpture of ash and quiet sorrow. Clara didn't wait for a reply. She turned and left, her footsteps sharper than usual on the porch boards. After the door closed behind her, Eli stood in silence for a long time. Then he reached for a whetstone and began sharpening. Not horseshoes, not plow teeth. Tools. Long, lean steel with purpose. The candle beside him flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Outside town, at a small ranch nestled against the scrubland, rancher Tom Baird sat beside his son on the porch. The boy was no older than 10, fiddling with a slingshot. Tom lit his pipe, then spoke without looking up. Boy, you ever wonder how that blacksmith come to be limping? The child nodded. Folks say it was a mine cave-in, Tom said. But when I rode with the 3rd Volunteers during the war, we had a gunsmith following us. Man didn't say much, but he could hit a coin at 70 paces and fix a colt faster than you could spit. Limped just like Mercer. Had the same burn scar on his right forearm, too. The boy's eyes widened. Tom smiled faintly. You be polite around that forge. There's things in this world older than the stories people tell. Back in town, the Bone Dust Gang found their swagger growing by the day. Riker and his brothers had no fear left, not of the sheriff, not of the townsfolk, and certainly not of the old man hammering metal down the street. They robbed a traveling preacher just outside the church, stripped him of his silver cross, and left his wagon overturned. They shot a stray dog that had followed them from a saloon, just because it barked. And one night, they torched a barn belonging to a young widow who'd refused Riker's advances. It burned to the ground in under an hour, livestock screaming into the smoke. Sheriff Nate pretended to investigate. He even had the gall to nail a sign on the livery door offering a $10 reward for information. But the ink was barely dry before he was seen drinking with the Bone Dust Boys at the saloon. His badge turned sideways, and his pistol mysteriously unloaded. Clara kept to her schoolhouse, but Riker didn't forget her. One evening, after the children had gone home, she locked up and found Riker waiting by the fence. He leaned with lazy menace, tipping his hat low and chewing on a matchstick. "I came by for my lesson," he said. Clara straightened. "Go back to whatever hole you came from." He grinned and stepped closer. "You got claws. I like that in a lady." When he reached for her, she slapped him hard. The crack of her palm echoed down the street. Riker's smile didn't fade. It hardened. "Next time," he whispered, "you won't walk away so easy." She pushed past him and marched toward the church, never once looking back. That night, Eli Mercer visited the Bone Dust Camp under moonlight. They'd made their makeshift quarters at the edge of town near the dry creek bed, sleeping with boots on and whiskey nearby. Lyle, Riker's younger brother, had a tall gray mare he doted on more than any woman. Eli moved like a ghost, silent as wind between rocks. He found the saddle, reached underneath, and nailed a crooked strip of iron just below the cinch, just enough to irritate the mare, but not enough to break her spirit. Then he disappeared into the dark. The next morning, Lyle mounted up with a yawn and gave the mare a kick. She bucked violently before they cleared the first fence. Lyle flew backward into a dry trough, nearly snapping his neck. The horse galloped into the distance, saddle torn loose. The Bone Dust Boys howled with laughter at first, until they realized how close he'd come to death. Riker's eyes narrowed. He sniffed the saddle and muttered, "This wasn't no accident." Still, there was no proof. Just suspicion, heavy as storm clouds. They laughed, but the edge had dulled. They drank harder that night and kept their hands closer to their holsters. And across town, the murmurs began. Someone was watching. Someone wasn't afraid. Someone had their eye on the Bone Dust Gang. They started saying his name again, not mockingly now, but with the uncertain tone people use when speaking of lightning striking twice. Cole Mercer. The limp didn't look so pitiful anymore. The hammer strikes from the forge didn't sound so hollow. The whispers spread like sparks on wind. Something was stirring in the ashes. The Bone Dust Gang was used to moving through towns like wind through dry grass, loud, hot, and gone before anyone dared raise a hand. But in Sable Creek, something had changed. They'd been there too long, lingered too deep. And now, one by one, little things started to go wrong. First it was Lyle's saddle again, tightened to the wrong hole. The leather mysteriously split. He cursed and limped for 2 days after the mare bucked him into a fence post. Then a wagon wheel collapsed on a flat stretch of road, the bolts cleanly sheared, like they'd been filed from underneath. Their whiskey barrels ran dry a week early, even though they'd been sealed. Their bullets rusted inside their cartridge belts. One morning, Riker woke to find the soles of his boots gone, sliced clean and folded under like paper. It wasn't enough to prove anything. It never was. But it was enough to start an itch under the skin, one they couldn't scratch. Jasper, the youngest Bone brother, felt it the most. One evening, he returned pale from a scouting ride through the canyon pass west of town. "Saw someone," he said, eyes darting between the firelight and the shadows. "Followed me about half a mile. Shadowed like a cat. Quiet." Riker leaned back, feet kicked up on a barrel. "You sure it wasn't your own reflection off that greasy hair of yours?" "I'm telling you," Jasper snapped. "They was watching. Didn't make a sound, but they was there." The rest of the gang laughed. Even Lyle, nursing his sore ribs, cracked a grin. But no one said it wasn't possible, because by then they all felt it. Clara noticed it too, but in Eli. Not the fear that everyone else imagined lived behind his silence, but something else. Something deliberate, like he was listening to a language no one else could hear. His eyes had stopped avoiding hers. Now they held her gaze, steady as iron cooling on an anvil. She came to the forge less often now, not out of anger, but wariness. She sensed that something had shifted in the blacksmith. The way he moved, the way he worked late into the night, candlelight flickering through the slats. Some nights, smoke curled from the chimney until dawn. Eli was building something. The contraption took shape slowly, forged in secret pieces, hammered smooth and curved like a crescent moon, welded to a weighted shaft with a leather-wrapped grip. It was too heavy for throwing, too shaped for horseshoeing. This was a weapon, built for one hand, built for close work. One night, as the forge burned low, Eli stared into the red coals and let memory swallow him whole. He'd been Eli Mercer then, but with a badge pinned to his chest and a different limp earned in pursuit. A U.S. Marshal in the territories, back when justice rode faster than telegrams. He'd chased men across Badlands, faced gunfire in ghost towns, stood against mobs in places too wild to name. But none of that broke him. What did was coming home late, to find smoke already rising. The small house, the one he built with his own hands, had been torched. His wife, Ellie, and their son, Daniel, caught inside by raiders looking for a bounty he never collected. They paid in blood, eventually. Eli made sure of that. But vengeance didn't warm a cold bed. He left the badge in a creek and walked west until the desert swallowed him. He found Sable Creek and never left. Until now. The gang didn't slow down. If anything, they grew meaner. One afternoon, Riker stormed into the general store and dragged old Miss Hazel's daughter, Ruthie, by the wrist, shouting for the best tobacco. When she spilled a tin on the floor, he laughed and forced her to kneel and clean it up with her hands. The townspeople watched from outside, helpless. The sheriff was locked in his own office, claiming he was handling negotiations. That night, the wind blew cold, and the town held its breath. In the morning, Riker's long duster coat, the one with silver buttons and bone-colored trim, hung from the top of the water tower. Strung by the sleeves, it flapped like a flag. Everyone saw it. No one claimed it. Riker stood in the middle of the street, eyes hard, jaw clenched. He stared at the coat, and then at the forge. Eli never looked up, just kept hammering. That evening, Clara heard a knock on her schoolhouse door just after dark. She opened it cautiously and found Eli standing on the step. He looked taller in the moonlight, shoulders squared despite the limp. He handed her a small cloth bundle, wrapped tightly and tied with leather cord. "What is it?" she asked, taking it gently. He didn't answer until she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a revolver, small, black-handled, oiled and clean as the day it was made. Her breath caught. "Eli, use it only if I don't come back," he said quietly. She looked up at him, holding his gaze like she never had before. "What are you doing?" "Finishing something." Her hands trembled slightly as she rewrapped the cloth. "I need to know. Who are you, really?" Eli took a long moment before answering. The forge smoke had left lines around his eyes, and age had bent his shoulders. But his voice came low and calm, steady as the first shot of a duel. "I'm a man trying to be better after being worse." Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Eli tipped his hat and walked off the porch, his limp dragging softly through the dust. The moon cast long shadows behind him, and as he passed the schoolhouse fence, the wind picked up, catching the edge of his coat and lifting it just enough to reveal the hammer tucked beneath his belt, curved, black, and heavy. By the time he reached the forge, the town had gone quiet. Windows closed, doors bolted, but lights remained on in every home. Something was coming, and they all knew whose name it would carry. The sun rose blood orange over Sable Creek the next morning, casting a sickly glow across the rooftops. A strange stillness clung to the town, one that settled in the chest like sickness before a storm. The Bone Dust Gang was already in the street by dawn, saddles creaking, boots thudding heavy against the cracked ground. Riker's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Bring the schoolmarm out here, or we burn the place with her in it." Children cried inside shuttered homes. Mothers held them back, desperate and quiet. The bell at the schoolhouse had not rung that morning. Clara stood just inside, the revolver Eli had given her trembling in her hand. Riker turned toward the saloon, spitting in the dust. "This town's got one last chance. Either the coward shows himself," he shouted, pointing his pistol at the schoolhouse doors, "or we start lighting matches." No one moved. The sheriff stood on his porch, hands half raised like he might be surrendering to the wind. His star looked smaller than ever pinned to his chest. He took one look at Riker, then at the townspeople huddled along boardwalks and windows. He stepped backward into his office and shut the door. Riker grinned. "That's what I thought." He turned to Lyle. "Get the oil." But before Lyle could move, the forge doors creaked open. Out walked Eli Mercer. He wore the soot-stained apron tied at his waist, blackened at the corners with old fire. His limp was more pronounced than usual, but his stride had purpose. Slow, steady. In his right hand, he held a forge hammer, its steel head black with use, still warm from the morning fire. Riker laughed. "Look what the wind dragged out. You gonna fix our boots, Grandpa?" Eli stopped in the center of the street, under the full weight of the rising sun, and raised his eyes to meet Riker's. "No," he said. "I'm here to bury you." The words landed like a shot. Silence fell across the street, thick and breathless. Even the wind dared not move. Riker's smile thinned. He looked to his brothers, gave a flick of his hand. "Kill him." Lyle stepped forward, drawing a long knife from his belt. He barely got 2 steps before a horseshoe spun through the air and struck him square in the temple. The sound was dull and final. Lyle crumpled to the ground, limbs twitching, blood pooling under his ear. Jasper and Boyd rushed forward, pistols half-drawn. Eli reached into his apron and hurled a pouch of powdered coal into the air. Black dust exploded between them as a gust of wind swept from the forge's open doors, smoke and ash catching the light. The 2 men staggered back, coughing, eyes burning. Eli moved through the cloud, like a figure out of legend. He struck Boyd behind the knee with the flat end of his hammer, then brought it down hard on the man's collarbone with a sickening crack. Boyd screamed, dropped his gun, and rolled into the dust. Jasper stumbled backward, half-blind, but Riker had already cleared his holster. "You should have stayed a ghost, Mercer," he roared, raising the gun. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. The custom hammer left his hand like a bullet, spinning through the smoky air, and struck Riker's wrist mid-pull. Bone snapped audibly. The pistol clattered to the ground, and Riker screamed in rage and pain, clutching the broken limb to his chest. Across the street, a shot rang out. One of the outlaws, Virgil, the mean-eyed one, had crept toward the schoolhouse, gun drawn. Clara stepped into the doorway. The revolver kicked in her hands, and the bullet punched into Virgil's shoulder. He spun from the impact and collapsed against the schoolhouse fence, groaning. For a moment, everything stilled again. The smoke drifted. The town held its breath. Eli limped forward, blood trickling from a fresh wound in his shoulder, where a stray round had grazed him during the chaos. Riker, still clutching his useless hand, reached for his belt knife. But Eli was already on him. He yanked a length of chain from his apron, rough, rusted, forged from his own scrap. With a grunt, he whipped it forward, wrapping it around Riker's throat and yanking hard. The gang leader stumbled, dropped the knife, and clawed at the chain. Eli didn't squeeze. He didn't need to. He just stared into Riker's eyes as the man gasped, showing him what real fear looked like, what it felt like to be small, to be hunted, to be known. Then, as Riker's face flushed red, Eli loosened the chain and let him drop into the dust. Riker wheezed, coughing, the dirt sticking to the spit at the corners of his mouth. Eli turned to the townsfolk. His voice was raw but carried like thunder. "This place can't live afraid," he said. "Not anymore. So stand with me, or stay down forever." At first, no one moved. Then Preacher Ellis stepped forward, Bible clutched in his hand like a club. Next came old Tom Baird, the rancher, carrying a pitchfork. Then came Hazel from the general store with a broken broom handle. One by one they emerged. Even the children stepped from the shadows, holding sticks and pans and anything they could find. The last of the bone dust gang, Jasper, and the wounded Virgil, looked up to find themselves surrounded. They turned, bolted, and fled down the main road, trailing dust behind them like cowards in retreat. Riker remained in the dirt, cradling his shattered wrist, eyes wide with disbelief. Clara stepped beside Eli, revolver still gripped tight, though her hands were shaking. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "I'll manage," Eli said. Behind them, the town came alive again, not just with noise, but with purpose. Doors opened wide. The sheriff stayed inside, forgotten. The people of Sable Creek moved like a tide, sweeping through the street, pulling each other upright. Eli stood at the center, bloodied, limping, breathing hard, but not bowed, not broken. The dust settled slowly. Smoke curled up from the forge like the end of a sermon. The chain hung loose in Eli's hand, and Riker Bone, once the terror of the frontier, wept quietly into the dust as the town he had tried to break stood tall again. The sun had slipped low over Sable Creek, casting the buildings in long amber shadows as the desert cooled into dusk. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara bent over Eli, hands steady as she threaded needle through skin. He didn't flinch, not even when she cleaned the wound with whiskey. His shirt was torn and blood-crusted, his face streaked with soot, and the weight of the day hung heavy on his broad shoulders. They didn't speak for a long time, just the soft sound of thread pulling tight, the clink of her tools, the muted song of crickets returning to a town that had almost forgotten them. When she tied off the final stitch and dabbed the wound with a clean rag, she let her hand linger on his shoulder. "You could have died," she said finally, not accusing, just tired. He gave a faint shrug. "Didn't." Clara smiled despite herself. "You're lucky." "I'm not," Eli replied, eyes lowered. "But I'm still here." They sat side by side on the bench beside the old schoolhouse stove, the kindling inside it unlit. In the silence between them, something old and aching shifted into something still and warm. She rested her head gently against his arm, and this time, he didn't pull away. The next morning, Sheriff Nate left his badge on the steps of the town hall and rode out without a word. No one stopped him. No one needed to. By noon, the townsfolk had gathered outside the saloon and taken a vote. Clara Winslow, schoolteacher and widow, was named interim justice of Sable Creek. She didn't ask for the role, but she didn't decline it either. When the preacher handed her the law book, she opened it and nodded once. Riker Bone was still alive. His wrist was splinted crudely, his pride shattered worse than his bones. They chained him in Eli's old horse stall, the same one he used to shoe the town's horses, feed strays, and rest in the heat of summer. Now the man who once terrorized a dozen counties sat behind iron bars, welded straight into the frame, watched day and night by armed citizens taking shifts. "We'll hold him here," Clara said to the people, standing tall in her boots, eyes unflinching, "until the marshal rides through. Let him see justice in the light, not the dark." The town nodded. No one argued. Over the following days, Sable Creek came alive in ways it hadn't in years. Miss Hazel's store reopened, her daughter Ruthie back at the counter. The saloon poured fewer drinks and more coffee. Children played stick duels in the street, giggling and shouting the name they'd all come to say like it was magic. "Cole Mercer. I'm Cole Mercer." "No, I'm Cole." "You're Riker, fall down." And they did, over and over, laughing in clouds of dust. Old Preacher Ellis nailed a cross back onto the chapel wall. The blacksmith's forge smoked every morning again, as it always had. Except now, folks passed by and tipped their hats, not just out of politeness, but out of respect. Stories bloomed like wildflowers. Some said Eli once rode with the legendary Hangtree Regulators, a group of ghost-like lawmen who never missed a shot. Others swore he was a bounty hunter who'd killed 24 men across the border, then buried his guns in a canyon after one job went too far. A drunk at the saloon claimed Eli was the reason the infamous Wilkes gang vanished from the Dakota hills, turned him to bones and ash, he said, slurring into his beer. But the truth, like the desert wind, kept its secrets. Eli didn't speak of the past. He just kept forging. Horseshoes, shovel heads, door hinges. Now and then, something heavier, quieter. When asked if he'd stay, he only said, "I never left." When someone pressed him on what he'd done before, he'd grunt. Different fire, same hammer. Clara kept visiting the forge, though now she brought dinner instead of coffee. Sometimes she sat on the steps and read while he worked. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. The silence between them had become something shared, something known. One dusty afternoon, a lone rider approached Sable Creek from the South Trail. His hat was clean, too clean for the desert. His boots still carried city polish, and his saddlebags had a shine that told of money or foolishness. He dismounted near the well and looked around, squinting through the late sun. A boy, no older than 7, stood nearby with a stick in his hand, straw hat flopping over one ear. "Hey there, son," the rider said. "Who runs this place now?" The boy didn't hesitate. He pointed toward the end of the street, where the forge stood, smoke curling from the chimney, the clang of metal ringing out in even rhythm. "The blacksmith," the boy said, grinning. "But don't cross him." The rider blinked. "No." The boy shook his head solemnly. "He once made the Bone Dust Gang shake. All of them, like leaves in a storm." The rider turned his gaze toward the forge, eyes narrowing, and there he saw him, Eli Mercer, limping through the dust, one hand brushing soot from his apron, the other holding a worn hammer. The forge glowed behind him, casting shadows tall and wavering like spirits rising from the ground. He walked with purpose, but not pride, with weight, but not burden. The wind swirled around his boots and lifted the corner of his coat, revealing a scar on his forearm, barely visible beneath soot and sweat. He didn't notice the rider watching. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. He was heading back to the fire, back to the work, like always. And as he vanished into the glow of the forge, the door creaking shut behind him, Sable Creek fell quiet again, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The hammer struck once, then again, and somewhere in the wind, the story began again, told in hushed tones, the way legends always are.